I know that for me, before I started delving into this, the idea of putting a painting together was just like completely foreign. It was almost out of the realm of possibility. And that was because I didn't have the right tools to put the puzzle pieces together.
Hey, I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and this week I'm talking to Kolbie of This Writing Desk, who is teaching us a step-by-step lesson on how to paint a watercolor landscape. And I promise she makes it so much less overwhelming than it sounds, and you're going to have a ton of fun with it. She also has a brand new book out, and she's giving away a copy. So stay tuned for the video to figure out how to enter, and let's jump right in. Kolbie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Becca. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you because you are now an author, and
I know.
I mean, is that the book sitting right in front of you, right there on the desk?
I just kind of have it sitting on here staring at me while I work all day.
It's just like, look, I'm accomplished, and it just makes
Yeah.
me feel great. That's awesome.
Made me. Yeah.
And I want to talk about the book, obviously, because it is very related to the lesson you're about to do. But before we do that, can you give people a little rundown of who you are, what you do, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I am a self-taught watercolor artist. I am also a writer. And the funny thing about me is I thought I was terrible at art for most of my life. I think that's a similar story for a lot of people who just, yep, who, join this community and realize, oh, it's actually totally welcoming and totally doable to develop skills like this. But I have a very distinct memory of being 10 in elementary school and doing some kind of art project and looking at the art project and looking at the instructor who was teaching the class and thinking to myself, I'm not very good at this. And so so I kind of just stopped doing art because I was good at other things. And then fast forward to when I was in college, I took a class. Oh, I can't even remember what the class was, but we had a unit on like the history of creativity or whatever. It was really cool. And one study that we looked at suggested a lot of children stop doing creative things like artwork specifically when they're around fourth grade or 10 years old because they realize that there is a gap between like where they are and where the professional people are, and so they think they're not good at it, and so they stop doing it. And it all of a sudden, anyway, that was obviously my story. And art was just kind of something that changed my life, so I'm really happy about it.
Love it. I want you to talk about your book a little bit because you also have agreed to give one away to people. So if you're watching this video, make sure you hit like on the video and then leave a comment literally saying anything, and you'll be entered in the draw to win Kolbie's book. So Kolbie, can you show us like a little bit of what's inside or talk about, how you broke it down and stuff?
Yes, I would love to. So the book is called Wilderness Watercolor Landscapes. It's a watercolor book on painting landscapes with watercolor repetitive. So I the whole premise of the book is because I'm a self-taught artist, you can totally teach yourself how to paint beautiful watercolor landscapes, and you don't have to worry about them being perfect or photorealistic. I think that often I know that for me, before I started delving into this, the idea of putting a painting together was just like completely foreign. It was almost out of the realm of possibility. And that was because I didn't have the right tools to put the puzzle pieces together, because in my mind, artists just kind of imagine something and then they divine it on the paper and they know exactly where to put everything, and it all just kind of falls into place. But that's not how art works. Art is actually something that you can learn piece by piece and put together and slowly practice and realize you've made something beautiful. And that's the whole point of this book.
So, I mean, I feel like we're privileged because we're going to get like a taste of the whole thing right now. But yeah, let's jump into the lesson.
Sounds good. Okay, before we start painting anything, I want to take a look at some landscape reference photos because there's a very good chance that you are interested in painting landscapes because you've been to some cool places or you follow some cool landscape photographers on Instagram, and wow, these pictures are just amazing. Our world is just so beautiful, right? But the thing is, when you think about actually putting these subjects on paper, it is so overwhelming because it's beautiful, but also, how can you possibly capture the beauty of all of these intricate and imperfect details all in one go? How can one person A, have the patience, and B, have the skill to take all of these elements and put them into a painting that will do it justice? If you've ever had thoughts like this, you are not alone, my friend, because that is exactly why I took so long to jump on the art train in the first place. Well, here's this little secret that I'm going to tell you. First of all, nature is inherently imperfect, and that means it is the perfect subject for you to start with, because if you are going to be quote unquote realistic, imperfection is realistic. And secret number two is, you don't have to paint landscapes to their exact realistic depiction. And in my opinion, that's because we have cameras to capture landscapes in the exact realistic depiction. And it takes a lot of skill and years and experience if you want to take your artistic ability into the photorealistic realm. But you don't have to. The point of art is to explore and voice something that you may be feeling inside, and to experience the process of creativity and love for what you see and what you feel. So, when I first started thinking about landscape photos, the idea of painting what you see felt so foreign to me, and like, okay, it sounds easy enough to paint what you see, but how though? I can't just look at a photo and then immediately paint every last detail. But the thing is, that's not what paint what you see means. Paint what you see means let go of any ideas and preconceptions you have about landscapes. So instead of looking at this painting, at this photo, and thinking, that's a tree, that's a mountain, that's the sky, think about literally what you see. So, literally, what I see, if I don't know any of these terms, is half of this photo is taken up by color. It's taken up by the color blue, and it is shifting from dark to light. So if I want to paint this sky, then I'm going to take one color and use a lot of paint at the top, and then gradually use the wet on wet technique to get lighter and use more water at the bottom. So we're going to talk a lot more about this later on in the tutorial, but I'm just kind of introducing the idea of painting what you see. I'm not going to think about, oh, I'm going to paint the sky. I'm going to think about what shapes that I can see and what colors I can see and how to place them on the paper. Okay, so painting what you see is important, but how do you go about placing them on the paper then? That is one of the all important questions that is also overwhelming, right? And that's another thing I want to talk about before we start painting, which is you don't have to paint everything all at once. You build paintings with layers. So let's take a look at, what do all of these landscapes have in common? They all have the sky. And then under the sky, they all have stuff. So when I look at landscapes, I typically divide them into the sky and the stuff below the sky, or the stuff encroaching on top of the sky. But still, that's the sky and the stuff below the sky. And then you can break those individual pieces into more doable and actionable parts of the landscape that you're painting. So I kind of like to think about this process in terms of creating a landscape recipe. And the most important parts of a landscape recipe are the background and the foreground. So you have the background, which is almost always the sky, and then you have the foreground, which is the stuff underneath the sky. Sometimes in between the sky and the foreground, you can have another background layer. So like in this photo, we have the sky, and then we have this like mountainous rocky area, and then we have these two middle layers that have some very small to us trees because they're farther away. And then even farther back behind, we have this like misty, hazy, mountainous area that is looks that way because it's even further in the background. So if I were trying to identify which layers in this photo were the background and the foreground, I would probably call these two layers the definite foreground, this hazy mountainous area and the sky. And then I would call these two layers, the background, these two layers are the background. And then these two layers are the foreground, where this little cliff is the definite foreground, and this is kind of like a sub foreground or a more prominent background layer. And not every landscape is as complicated as this. A lot of them, so like if I go night, sky, I don't know, night sky forest. I do night skies a lot, and that's one thing that we're going to look at. If I take a look at this photo right here, there's the sky, so that's the background layer. And then there's this layer of trees silhouetted in front of the sky. That's the foreground layer. And so landscapes can be they can be complicated and have many layers, but you can always identify if they are in the background or if they are in the foreground. And then once you're able to separate those two layers, it is much easier to go about tackling how to paint them. So I'm just going to type in, let's just take a look at one more to see if we can identify some more layers here. This looks like another a 3-layer one. So we have the sky, this beautiful Milky Way colorful sky, and then we have this mountain right here. And so this mountain is kind of like in the middle of it looks like the foreground layer, but then we see that underneath the mountain is also a layer of trees, probably on top of the mountain. And so the way that I would paint this, instead of saying, oh, well, the trees are on the mountain, so they all belong in the same layer, I would say, no, I see a layer of sky, I see a layer of a white mountain with just a little bit of mountainous rocky darkness in it, and then I see a layer of trees, and that's how I would go about painting that. So you start with the background, and then you move up to the foreground, and that is how you paint just about every landscape piece, especially when you start simple and start from the beginning. You identify which layers are in the background and which layers are in the foreground, and then you go back to front. And it sounds simple, and maybe it sounds too simple or too good to be true, but that's really all there is to it. And the more you can get those processes in your brain, the more you can remember how to build landscape recipes by saying, okay, for this piece, I'm going to start with the sky, and then I'm going to paint the mountain, and then I'm going to paint the trees. The more you can identify where all of the puzzle pieces fit together, the more complex pieces you will be able to do. And the stronger your sense of placing these pieces will become. So now let's take a look at the different pieces that you can start with, even if you don't have a reference photo. So let's say that looking at reference photos is a little daunting. You understand the idea that you start from back to front and you have to identify the background and the foreground layers, but it's still a little tricky for you to be able to, paint what you see and let go of the preconceptions that you start with, that you need to paint all of those details all at once. I get it. I really do. I didn't start painting with reference photos. I started painting basically simple versions of the elements in the wilderness that I knew existed. And you can use these as your landscape recipe. So we kind of talked about how there are background and foreground layers, right? And sometimes a landscape recipe just has a sky and something else. So you can do skies and trees, or skies and mountains, or you can do a combination of all three. For sure, starting with the sky, and usually if you do all three, you start with the skies, you do the mountains because the mountains are bigger and are likely more in the distance, and then you do the trees. So let's take a look at different options that we have of putting these subjects together. The first kind of sky I usually paint is a monochrome gradient. So I'm going to, and often the monochrome gradient is a night sky. So to paint these skies, I usually start with the wet on wet technique, meaning I get my paper wet first before I start painting. So I'm getting my paper wet with some clean water, and then I'm going to take some of my very favorite dark blue. It's Winsor & Newton's Payne's Gray. And starting from the top, I'm putting my paint down on top of the paper, and then moving in a side to side or edge to edge motion, as I like to call it. I'm just moving my paintbrush down, and you notice that the paint gets lighter the further down I go. That's because of the water on the paper and just the nature of watercolor. The more pigment I let go of, the more pigment I loose onto the paper as I'm moving, the less pigment is on my paintbrush. So less pigment means it's going to be lighter. And then just to finish off this gradient, I cleaned off my paintbrush, and I'm going to use water from the bottom because I want the white of the paper to show through at the bottom. I want my gradient to be pretty stark. So I'm starting really dark at the top, and then I washed off my paintbrush and picked up again while the paint was still wet, and just continued along toward the bottom. And then I'm going to do one more thing to smooth out this gradient. I'm going to have clean water on my brush again, and starting from the bottom, I'm going to paint upward, just so the paint kind of smooths itself out and I don't have super harsh lines. Another thing that I can do if I want to create even more contrast is to pick up some more Payne's Gray and paint this dark paint on top of it again, and basically just do another layer. But this time I'm going to stop in the middle, pick up my paintbrush and wash it off, and then use clean water to bring it down so that I don't get the bottom too dark. So I'm just going to bring the paint down, and then start from the bottom again and smooth out the gradient. So once my night sky is all dry, then I'm going to, just to add a little bit more, oomph and dazzle to it, I'm going to take some white gouache with a small detail brush and just splatter some of that paint right on top of the dry night sky. And that is a two-step process to create a starry night, and it's pretty simple. And this is one of my very favorite background layers for a lot of landscape paintings. Another version of the sky that I use a lot is a gradient also, but it's a sunset instead. So instead of one dark monochrome gradient, it's kind of more of like a choppy, multicolored gradient. So I started with some alizarin crimson and scarlet lake and yellow ochre, and then while this is still wet, I'm going to take some of my yellow ochre and just like make a little zigzag pattern that goes up to the corner of my sunset like that. And that kind of just creates some fun, imperfect like glow from the sun and different colors of the sunset to create a different kind of texture in the background. Let's take a look at how to paint layered mountains. So first, you can paint a mountain that is like a silhouette version or just kind of stands alone by starting off. If you want that like middle layer, I would recommend having some kind of point to the mountain, but mountains don't have to look like that always. They should have a little bit of imperfection to them, some like loose, natural looking, crags and bumps along the way, and it doesn't have to be that perfect triangle of a mountain. I think that's one of the most common mistakes, especially for beginners, is trying to paint mountains that look like triangles. But instead, think about them like triangles, but add little jags to them, add little imperfections, little movements to your mountain by just gently moving your brush and kind of spazzing it out a little bit. And that is going to help your mountain have a more realistic kind of craggy shape. So you can do a mountain that's kind of like a stark silhouette, just like that, just like one layer of mountain. And if I were to just like transfer this onto the sunset sky, that would look pretty cool, right? And so that's kind of the point of landscape recipes, is thinking about all of these different elements separately and then what will happen when you layer them on top of each other. So that's one way that you can paint mountains. You can also paint mountains in layers themselves. And the way that you would do that is by going from light to dark. So if I'm going to go light to dark, that's why I'm holding this palette here the whole time. I know that in order to get watercolor to go lighter, I need to add water. So I'm adding water to my little palette full of phthalo turquoise here. And then I'm going to paint a little layer of mountain right here. That's a little jaggedy. It's a little bumpy, but also kind of smooth. It doesn't have to have those sharp crags that every mountain has. So this first background layer is dry of the mountain, and then I painted another layer on top of it, but kind of just below, with slightly more pigment. So it's the same color, but the pigment to water ratio has a little more paint than water in it. And that is what makes it darker. And now I'm going to finish this little layer of mountains, this little mountain range, with the darkest layer of paint right on top of the dry layers. When you paint layers of paint of watercolor on a dried layer of paint that's already there, it's called glazing. So we are using watercolor to create these really soft, delicate layers of mountains and going from light to dark to create a depth effect. So that is another really fun and cool way to use watercolor to paint imperfect but fun, loose watercolor mountains. And painting the mountains this way with all of these different layers in the different lightness or value, we could also like just plop this mountain range on top of the sunset or on top of the night sky, and it would look really cool. So now let's take a look at the different kinds of trees that you can have that you can paint with loose watercolor landscapes. Trees can be hard. Trees can be tricky, but I have a style of trees that I really love, and I call them blobby trees. So I'm going to take some of this phthalo turquoise again, and I'm going to show you how I do this. So I'm using a small paintbrush. You don't have to use a small one, but especially when I'm first learning how to paint trees, I typically do. And I'm going to start with the trunk. I'm using a small and pretty watery paint. So I'm starting with the trunk, and I want to keep the top of my tree. For the record, I'm just doing pine trees. This is just like a loose pine tree. I'm starting just a little bit below the tip of the trunk when I start to paint the needles, because I want the tip top of the pine tree to still show. So I'm going to start just a little bit below, and then I'm just going to paint some blobs on either side of my tree, just like that. And the blobs, if you're using a small round paintbrush like I am, sometimes your blobs might come out kind of line-like, like that. Like you might just be painting a line. And so the way that I avoid that line is to, instead of going straight out with my blob, I am going to put my paintbrush down and then kind of move it around a little bit. And maybe not use the whole bristle, the whole length of the belly of the brush, but use just the tip a little bit to move my paintbrush very slightly to create these watery, like mark-y kind of blobs. And so I'm going to try to make those blobs on either side of my tree. And this is one of the easiest ways to paint loose watercolor pine trees. These are not meant to be super realistic. They're just meant to capture the essence of the pine trees that we are trying to paint, right? Because that's what loose watercolor landscapes, that's what we're doing with loose watercolor. We're saying we don't need to capture all of these elements perfectly. We just want to capture the feeling and the depth that we feel when we look at landscapes, when we look at the world, and do our best to help our art reflect that. And nature is imperfect, like I said. So using my small paintbrush to just paint these blobs that are kind of in the shape of, the traditional pine needles that kind of go down, I am going to form these trees. And now this is where I'm also going to say there are so many different ways that you can paint pine trees. And also, as you're watching me, you may think to yourself, that's super easy. And then you try it and it's not so easy. I have painted thousands of trees, and my first trees didn't look so good. They looked a little messy. They looked a little sloppy. And it took me a little bit of time to practice and to focus on the technique that I really liked the best. And so I'd highly recommend practicing and recognizing that the more trees you paint, the better you're going to be at painting them. So in order to put all these together and make our loose watercolor landscape, let's think about our landscape recipe. So we want a sky and some mountains and some trees. So in terms of how it's going to go, I'm going to start with the sky, and then I'm going to paint a mountain. I think I'm just going to do this one layer deal over here, and then I'm going to paint some trees in the foreground. So for this final project piece, I have a piece of nice paper, so my 100% cotton cold press paper. This is Arch's brand. And then I just have some regular old masking tape that I'm going to use to tape it to my desk around the edges so that the paint stays within the center of the paper and to keep my paper taut. So first, we are going to take a pretty big brush and get the paper wet. I'm going to do a sunset and a mountain and some trees. So this landscape is going to have 3 layers. And in order to paint the sunset, I want to start with a wet surface so that I can use the wet on wet technique. So I'm getting my paper wet first, and then I'm going to paint the gradient using 3 colors, using red, orange, and yellow. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So I have most of this gradient. Notice that I put on the different colors going edge to edge using really wet paint so that the colors will blend together. And I put on multiple brushfuls of each color to make it a little more vibrant. And then, similar to how we practiced, I'm just going to finish it off with a little zigzag of yellow to give the sky just a little more texture, a little more complexity, and that is going to add some subtle shifts of light in the sky because the yellow of the paint and the wet of the water is pushing away the pigment and leaving room for this kind of little glimmer effect. The sky is now dry, and now I'm going to paint a layer of mountain. And because this mountain is going to be like the mid layer, right? It's going to be not quite the foreground, but not quite the background. So you could probably still call it a quasi background layer. I'm not going to make the color its full opacity. So I'm going to take some of this turquoise, and actually I'm going to combine the turquoise with just a little bit of my favorite Payne's gray to make it a slightly more shaded color. And I'm going to make sure that it has some water in the palette. So I'm not just using the straight pigment. I'm using a little bit of water so that it's a little more transparent and not quite as dark as the trees, which I'm going to paint as the final foreground layer. So for this mountain, I'm just going to kind of start down at the bottom like this and give it a few natural jagged edges, and then make sure when you're painting these mountain layers you use your whole brush and you use pretty watery paint so that you can quickly, while the paint is still wet, bring it all the way down to the bottom, because if you let the paint dry before you have a chance to pull it down, then you may have dried paint lines on your mountain layer, and that's not super ideal. It's something you can cover up sometimes, but the best way to paint these really smooth layers of mountains is to get really wet paint, use your whole brush to kind of outline the mountain layer, and then as fast as you can, get more paint and water and bring it down so that you have this nice wet mountain layer to work with. And then if you want to create kind of like a subtle gradient within the mountain layer while it's still wet, you can paint using the ridge of the mountain as a kind of boundary to add some darker paint just right on top. I don't want to add the super dark paint to the whole thing because, like I said, I want the trees that will be in front of this to be the main event, to be the main foreground subject, and so I want those to be the darkest in this particular landscape where I'm kind of focusing on creating silhouettes up against this sunset sky, right? But I can still add some of that paint at the top and then just use a watery brush to blend in that mountain layer and create some like subtle shifts in light and mist. One way to create kind of a quasi-misty effect is to take your paintbrush and water, and while the paint is still wet, start from the bottom and just push that clean water up so it creates almost like clouds along the bottom of this mountain so that the light and the yellow of the sky is showing through from the previous layer on the paper, but in like these cloudy kind of effect to mimic the look of mist coming up from the ground. The mountain is dry, and now let's paint just a few trees using that blobby technique that we practiced earlier in this lesson. And then for the trees, I'm going to use Payne's Gray again. When you use a really pigmented Payne's Gray, it looks almost black. And I prefer to use Payne's Gray instead of black because it looks more natural against these colors. Instead of washing them out, it kind of helps to brighten them. So I'm using this really pigmented Payne's Gray, and I wanted to get it just a little watery so I don't get a dry brush effect. And figuring out where to place these trees, I want to just kind of eyeball it and see where might be a good spot to direct the eye. So I could place, typically I like to do like one big tree and then a few shorter trees around it. And so I could place the tree here or I could place the tree here. And I think I'm going to put the tree here because this spot over here kind of looks like the sun is peeking behind the mountain. And it's going to look cool if I have maybe a few little trees encroaching into that space, but I want the mountain and the tree to kind of point down to the sun in this like diagonal kind of position. So I'm going to put one big tree right in front, and this having one focal tree, one tree that kind of like reaches above everything and encroaches on everybody else's space is going to help focus and bring complexity to the painting composition wise, and it's going to create depth in the painting. So I'm still using my number, this is a 2/0 brush, so it's a really small brush, and you don't have to use this small of a brush, but it works pretty well for me, even with slightly bigger trees like this. So I'm using that brush, and I'm just painting blobs on either side. And they're kind of messy blobs, as most blobs are. That's why this tree painting technique is called the blobby painting technique, because it's not supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be messy and unruly, just like real trees are in real life. So I'm just using my eyes to make sure the tree doesn't get too wide at the bottom. I want it to be about like that. I don't want it to be like a giant tent of a tree, just like this kind of skinny, stocky pine tree. And this will be the biggest tree that we paint. So I'm painting this tree, and sometimes your trunk may show through when you paint these kinds of trees. When that happens, you can even just paint another little layer of needles, right, of blobby needles right on top, and that will only help you to create that depth effect in the trees. So now I have that one big tree, and now I'm going to paint a few other sized trees just kind of along this area. So first I'm going to start over here. I know that I want to paint a tree or two that kind of encroach in the sun's area, but not so much that it distracts from it. So I'm going to paint these to be just a little smaller. These are like treetops that are just a little farther away than this giant tree. And so it's going to be just a little smaller than the other one. And then I'm going to paint one more that barely reaches over the top of that mountain and into the sky. And then I'm going to paint a few more little trees all around to kind of fill in the rest of the tree line. I could leave it as is with just these trees and have them be treetops, but I'm going to paint just a few more around them to create a little more complexity in the piece. So watch as I paint these in this little time lapse. And to just add one final touch of an element to give, diversity and complexity, I'm just going to paint some really small, simple birds using a V with a little tip, or an upside down V with a little tip. That's like the head of the bird with the wings, the head of the bird with the wings, and then one smaller one just like that. Whenever I paint birds, I like to do them in odd numbers, usually 3 or 5, and also different sizes. So like some of them are very far away, like this one right here, and then some of them may be close up as they are traveling more toward you. And that wraps up this mini landscape tutorial where we talked about layers and starting from back to front, and landscape recipes, so breaking down a landscape in terms of doable chunks with the background layer and the midground layer and then the foreground layer, and using different shapes and diversity of shapes and composition to help make the piece not boring. So once you're done with that, then you can just take off your tape. Ultimately, I hope that you learned a lot. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope that you walk away knowing painting beautiful landscapes is totally within your grasp. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Okay, so first of all, I thought about this when you were talking about the way your book was broken down, but it was evidenced even more in your lesson, is just that the way that you break down watercolor is I guess the reason why I love it so much and relate to it so much is because that's the way I break down calligraphy for people. Mm-hmm. Starting with the very basics and building up all of those things and making it a recipe instead of just looking at a letter and trying to draw it, instead of looking at a painting and trying to paint it. It's all the different pieces. So I love the way you broke that down.
Yeah, thanks. Similar to you and your process, the reason that's the way it clicked for me. It was revolutionary when I realized, oh, it's not it's not some big unknown mystery. There are actually puzzle pieces that I can use, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be, exactly the way that somebody else does it. It can just be the way that I like to do it, and that can be cool. One thing about recipe, I'm pretty sure I spelled recipe wrong when I wrote landscape recipes. So anyway, the English major in me is cringing when I look when I look back at that. But the recovering perfectionist in me was like, well, we're just going to show all of our flaws because we're all human, and even English majors spell things wrong. So
I mean, you're talking about letting things be imperfect, so
yep. I have to, own up to my own rules and just let things be.
I love it. Well, Kolbie, thank you so much for coming on. And I think that, anybody who relates to that recipe breakdown and turning art into more of a formula kind of thing is going to really benefit from that kind of book. So again, if you're watching this, make sure you hit like and leave a comment down below and you could win Kolbie's book. But I also want to let people know where they can just get it and then also where they can find you. So hit us with that information.
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about the book and links to all the different places you can purchase it, just go to thiswritingdesk.com/book. Super easy to remember because This Writing Desk is also my Instagram handle. And then thiswritingdesk.com is my website. So those are all the places that you can learn more about the book and learn more about me. I'm also on Skillshare, so if you decide you dig my video tutorials, I have more than 25 classes on Skillshare. A lot of them are wilderness focused. But the book, it's important to note that the book has exclusive designs.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks again so much for coming on, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Becca.
Bye.